So we left off in lecture talking about our last of the enveloped negative strand, single-stranded RNA that had one big long chunk of RNA. We're going to move on to our little red group. Still have envelopes. They still have negative strand, single-stranded RNA, but all of their RNA is in segments. And for the ones that do have these segmented RNA, there's three main families. There's the Orthomixaviridae family, kind of the most common one. There's the Arenaviruses family and the Bunyaviruses family. Now we're going to start first talking about the Orthomixaviridae family, which is generally the one that's most common or commonly heard of because it's the family that we find the flu virus in. The Bunyaviruses and Arenaviruses, a lot of viruses in those two families infect animals. Not all of them, though. We'll talk about some exceptions. But a lot of them affect animals, and we pick them up either with contact with the animals or through biting insects like ticks or mosquitoes that bite the animals, then bite us. But we're going to first start with the flu viruses. So there are two main types of flu virus. There's type A and type B. They're all picked up and spread by inhalation. And the main part that this virus targets in the body are the lung cells. And they are going to eliminate your epithelial lining of your lung tissue. That's your first line of defense. In our immune system, your mucous membrane, which is made up of epithelial cells, is your first line of defense. So your lungs is losing its complete first line of defense. That means everything you breathe in has full access to your body now. And that's the scary part with the flu. And so it's very common that after you suffer from the flu virus, you almost always pick up some type of secondary bacterial infection or some secondary viral infection that goes along with it because you lose that first line of defense. Now, the symptoms for flu: fever, malaise, headache, and myalgia or muscle pain. They're all caused by chemicals called cytokines, which are produced by the immune system. But the one symptom that usually students are, but what about nausea and vomiting? That's part of the flu. It's not. Vomiting and nausea are not part of the flu. If you have fever, malaise, headache, muscle pain, you have the flu. And if you're also vomiting or have diarrhea, you have something else too. Maybe it's a norovirus. Maybe it's some bacterial infection. You have something else. But vomiting and nausea are not symptoms of the flu. But again, you lose your first line of defense, so it's extremely common to pick up something else with it when you're suffering from the flu. Now, the flu virus itself, the outside of it has two glycoproteins, the NAs and HAs, don't care what they stand for, and a mic, and they vary in how many NAs they have, how many HAs they have. Lots of different flu strains, and their NAs and HAs all vary a little bit. Now, the inside genetic material, again, the Orthomixaviridae has segmented RNA, and the flu actually has 8 segments of RNA. So all of the genetic material is in 8 segments. But because the NAs and HAs vary, every slight variation in that pattern of NAs and HAs is a completely different flu virus. And so if you notice, even on this one, it has a pattern of almost 3 to 1, of 3 HAs to 1 NA, but there's some variety in that. Well, this particular pattern, that's the pattern for this particular flu strain. And they change. Anytime a flu virus gets into a cell, they shuffle up and change a little bit. Which means if someone suffers from the flu, what they cough or sneeze out is a slightly different flu virus. Now, this slight change in the virus itself is what's known as antigenic drift. Now, you should know the difference between antigenic drift and antigenic shift. It's a guarantee there's a question on your next exam between the difference on these. So antigenic drift, it's just slight changes, slight recombinations of some of the RNA, which leads to slight changes on the outside. It ends up being a brand new virus. But again, that's the scary part. Anytime someone gets the flu, there are slight changes. And really, when you get the flu, what you're coughing out is a whole new flu virus. Depending on what happened while it was in your body, what you cough out or sneeze out could be a really deadly strain. We don't know. But the more people that get the flu, the more chances are that we're going to get some, worse flu virus. Now, antigenic shift is when you take two completely different flu viruses and you mix up their genetics and then spit out a whole new virus. So it's not just a slight change in one particular virus. We are recombining two different viruses to make a whole new one. Now, I love your book because you're like how your book color codes stuff. Antigenic drift is when you get the flu virus in your cells, what comes out changes just a little bit. So instead of green going in, it now comes out as kind of a teal or bluish color. It just changed a little bit. However, antigenic shift is when you take two completely different viruses, they go into a cell, all of their genetics recombine, and what comes out, red and blue make purple. We get a whole new flu virus. Now, this happens quite often when you take a virus that infects human and mixes with a virus that infects animals. And all of a sudden we have a complete new virus that can infect humans. And some of them can be really deadly strains of flu. This happens with the swine flu and the bird flu. And the unique part about it, it seems to happen about every 10 years. About every 10 years we seem to get a new combination of animal flu plus human flu gives us a completely new flu. Well, the swine flu happened the winter of 2009-2010, so we're due for a new flu virus, and they do. The CDC has a few top bird flu mostly viruses that they're concerned about, that when it mixes with a human strain of flu virus, we might get a really deadly strain. So I'm like, we'll see what happens this winter. Now, diagnosing the flu usually go based on signs and symptoms during the outbreak. Treatment, if you can get those symptoms soon enough, we do have a couple drugs called oseltamivir and zanamivir, sometimes more commonly known as Tamiflu and Relenza. These help block the virus from being released from infected cells, and so it's not going to be spreading and infecting as many cells as quickly. It helps your immune system tackle the ones that are infected. Now, the best prevention for the flu, getting rid of infected birds or other flu-infected animals, that hopefully we don't get those new strains of viruses, and getting the vaccine. Now, vaccines for the flu, they try to track, I'm going to go back, they try to track what's happening with the trends of the NAs and HAs. If they notice one year that, the viruses seem to have a few more NAs, they seem to be getting more NAs, they're going to develop flu vaccines against strains of the flu that have more NAs or HAs or certain patterns. They try to track what's happening. However, they're not always correct. It's, we're making educated guesstimates on what we think is going to happen. Some years we're better at guessing, some years we're not. But anytime a flu goes inside one person, it can come out slightly different. It's a whole other strain we have to develop some type of vaccine for. We're working on getting better vaccines, ones that target, instead of just tracking the NH and HAs, we're really trying to work on, how can we track the actual RNA? That doesn't vary quite as much as those NAs and HAs recombinations. We're still working on it, though. I'm going to guess in the next 5-10 years we're going to have a much better flu vaccine. Now, our next group are the Bunyaviruses, and a lot of the Bunyaviruses are zoonotic viruses, meaning they infect animals. We pick them up through biting arthropods, like mosquitoes or ticks or biting flies. Most of the symptoms are quite mild, and so usually it's slight, minor flu-like symptoms or minor cold symptoms. However, some can cause some more severe cases. There's one that causes what's known as Rift Valley fever, California encephalitis. Our very own La Crosse strain of encephalitis is a Bunyavirus. And another one that's not spread by arthropods, instead we inhale it from dried mouse urine or feces, are hantaviruses. They cause what's known as the hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. It causes a pneumonia, and depending on the health of the individual, it could be a fatal pneumonia. There are cases of hantavirus around here. It's pretty rare, but there are still hantavirus strains around. Really, there's no treatment for it. It's just limit your contact with rodents. Most of these other is limit your contact with the biting arthropods, making sure you've got the bug spray on. And so I'm like, we've got Bunyaviruses around. The Arenaviruses, a lot of them are zoonotic viruses. Not all of them. We'll talk about a couple that aren't. And most of them cause hemorrhagic fevers. And so a fever, sometimes with bleeding. Now, many of them are found or spread by rodents in Africa and South America, and they can lead to severe bleeding, as well as that extreme fever. Some can lead also to what's known as lymphocytic choriomeningitis, which causes flu-like symptoms, and not meningitis. They used to think it caused meningitis, and they figured out it wasn't caused by these particular viruses, but the name still stuck. And some of these are transmitted by aerosols or contaminated food. So they're not all spread by animals. Some strains of viruses that cause other issues are spread by food and airborne. And one particular virus called the Lassa fever virus is spread by bodily fluids. Best just to not pick up any of them. Limit your contact with rodents if you're in Africa or South America. Otherwise, a lot of it's just good hygiene, proper universal precautions to pick them up. Another arenavirus that's not an animal virus is hepatitis D. It's transmitted by bodily fluids, usually through sexual activity or contaminated needles. The interesting part about this particular virus is that it can't reproduce on its own. No viruses can. They have to hijack a host cell. But even if hepatitis D virus gets into a cell, still can't hijack and replicate itself. It instead requires the hepatitis B DNA. And I'm like, it needs hepatitis B for it to reproduce. And so this is that virus that if you have hepatitis B, you're going to suffer some symptoms, but most people survive. If you have hepatitis D only, you're not going to have a lot of issues, if any. But if you have the two together, then it becomes deadly. That's when this the two cells reproducing together and hepatitis D using hepatitis D to reproduce, this is when it causes severe damage to liver cells and becomes very deadly. It will destroy the liver. Now, people that do survive are always going to be at a higher risk of developing liver cancer later on. Now, what's nice is we can vaccinate against it. We don't have a vaccine specifically against hepatitis D, but we do have a vaccine against hepatitis B. As long as you can stop your body from getting hepatitis B, you ultimately are also stopping your body from getting hepatitis D. So that one vaccine really is actually vaccinating you against two things. Now, our final group are they're naked, they don't have any envelope, and they're segmented double-stranded RNA. Now, double-stranded RNA is extremely unique. The only organisms out there that have double-stranded RNA are viruses. There are no other living organisms out there that have double-stranded RNA. And there's only one group that even does have this double-stranded RNA. It's the Rotaviruses group. Now, there are lots of strains of not lots, but there are several strains of Rotaviruses viruses, but the most common are the Rotaviruses. Now, they're called Rota because they used to think they look like little rotating wheels. That's where they get their name. But these viruses are the leading cause of infantile gastroenteritis, meaning it's going to cause your food poisoning symptoms, diarrhea, vomiting, usually the diarrhea. Now, in developing countries that can't replace the fluids and electrolytes, it could lead to death. And I'm like, here in the United States, you don't have to go very far to get a drink of water. to replace those fluids. And so it's not deadly around here. There's rare cases of it, but it's generally not deadly in developed country. Now, it does cause a lot of diarrhea, and the top way it's transmitted, fecal oral. Now, we do have a vaccine for it now that's pretty new. And before the vaccine, they generally, because kids are dirty, said about 100% of all kids in the United States picked up a rotavirus before they turned 4. And I'm like, it was extremely common, and kids are dirty and cause lots of diarrhea in kids. Luckily, it doesn't cause too much more than that. It's self-limited. It goes away. The virus leaves with the diarrhea. The only treatment is just replace those fluids and electrolytes. Best to not get in the first place. Good hygiene, sewage treatment, and getting vaccinated. And so we can save lots and lots of people just because of the vaccine. At the end is just a nice little summary of all of the families, what kind of RNA they have, whether they're enveloped or not, what do the shapes look like, what are the different viruses that fit into all these families. So I'm like, lots and lots of viruses. But we're going to leave there. We're going to do some more reviewing before your next exam.